Sometimes the most profound moments happen when you're literally walking away. Sometimes courage finds you in the space between goodbye and the door. And sometimes, a woman who's lived enough life to know exactly what she wants will stop you in your tracks with 7 simple words that change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lisa, and at 38, I thought I had figured out the rhythm of my life. I work as a yoga instructor at the Harmony Community Center in Denver, teaching evening classes to a mix of stressed-out professionals, determined retirees, and the occasional college student who wandered in looking for an easy credit. It's not the life I planned when I graduated with a degree in marketing, but after my divorce 3 years ago, I needed something that felt healing rather than hustling. The community center became my sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the Colorado sunset, hardwood floors worn smooth by thousands of bare feet, and the kind of peaceful energy that settles into your bones after years of people seeking balance within those walls. I loved the predictability of it all. Tuesday evening gentle flow, Thursday power yoga, Saturday morning restorative sessions. My life had become a carefully choreographed sequence, and I preferred it that way. Most of my students were regulars, faces I'd grown familiar with over the months. There was Patricia, our center manager, who took my Thursday class religiously despite being the least flexible person I'd ever met. Danny, my coworker who taught the kickboxing class after mine, always made jokes about how he undid all my zen with his aggressive workout routines. And then there was Mark. Mark had been coming to my Tuesday evening class for about 6 months. He was quiet, focused, and surprisingly graceful for someone who claimed he'd never done yoga before joining my class. At 45, he had the kind of presence that filled a room without demanding attention. Salt and pepper hair that he kept, just slightly too long, laugh lines that suggested he found joy in small moments, and hands that moved with the precision of someone who built things for a living. I later learned he was an architect, which explained the way he approached each pose like he was designing something beautiful and sustainable. What I noticed most about Mark wasn't his flexibility or his dedication to showing up every week. It was the way he listened when I gave instructions, like every word mattered. The way he helped other students adjust their mats or offered to carry equipment without being asked. He had this quiet kindness that made the whole class feel more connected, more community-centered. But we rarely spoke beyond the usual pleasantries. "Hello, how was your day? See you next week." I told myself it was professional boundaries. Really, it was fear. After my divorce, I'd become an expert at keeping people at arm's length, especially men who seemed too good to be true. My ex-husband had taught me that charm could hide damage, and kindness could be a mask for manipulation. So I stayed polite, stayed distant, stayed safe. My sister Jessica had other ideas. Jessica was my opposite in almost every way. Where I sought calm, she created energy. Where I built walls, she knocked them down with a smile and a bottle of wine. She was a real estate agent with the kind of personality that could sell ice to penguins, and she'd been trying to sell me on the idea of dating again for the past year. "Lisa," she said during one of our weekly coffee dates, "you can't spend the rest of your life in emotional child's pose. At some point, you have to stand up and reach for something." I rolled my eyes at her yoga metaphor. "I'm perfectly happy with my life as it is." Perfectly happy or perfectly terrified? She shot back with that annoying accuracy that only sisters possess. Because there's a difference between contentment and hiding. Jessica had been watching me teach a Saturday morning class the week before and immediately zeroed in on Mark. "The architect," she called him, like he was already part of our family. Conversations. "The way he looks at you when you're not paying attention. The way you suddenly get more animated when you're giving him adjustments. You two are doing this elaborate dance around something obvious." I laughed it off, but Jessica's words stuck with me. Was I doing a dance? Was there something I was missing? Or worse, something I was actively avoiding. The truth was, I had noticed things about Mark that I probably shouldn't have. The way he always wore blue or gray, colors that made his eyes more striking. How he stayed a few minutes after class to help stack bolsters and fold blankets. The fact that he never missed a Tuesday, even when I'd seen him limping in with what was clearly a minor injury. There was a consistency to his presence that felt rare in my experience with people. Danny, my coworker, had zero filter when it came to observations about my personal life. After my Thursday class one evening, he cornered me while I was cleaning the mirrors. "So when are you going to ask out Tuesday night blue shirt?" he said, not even pretending to be subtle. "Tuesday night blue shirt?" I asked, though I knew exactly who he meant. "The architect, the guy who practically meditates when you talk, the one who's been coming to your class for months and clearly isn't here for the spiritual enlightenment alone." Danny grinned. "Unless you're completely oblivious, which is possible given your track record with reading romantic signals." I threw a yoga block at him, which he dodged with the reflexes of someone who taught combat sports. "There are no romantic signals. He's a student. I'm his instructor. It's professional." "Professional my ass," Danny laughed. "The man times his water breaks to when you demonstrate poses. He asks questions he definitely knows the answers to just to keep you talking. And last week, I swear I saw him coordinate his outfit to match your teaching uniform." That last comment made me pause. Had Mark been wearing blue more often? I tried to remember what I'd been wearing in recent classes. My usual teaching attire was simple: black leggings and a fitted top in various colors. But I did have a preference for blue tops. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They made me feel confident and calm simultaneously. The following Tuesday, I found myself paying more attention to Mark than I should have during class. He was wearing a navy blue t-shirt that was almost the exact shade of the blue top I had on. When our eyes met during a seated twist, he smiled in a way that made my stomach flutter. It was the kind of smile that suggested he was thinking something he wasn't saying out loud. After class, as students were rolling up their mats and filtering out, Mark approached me with that careful deliberation he brought to everything. "Great class tonight, Lisa," he said, and there was something different in his tone, less formal, more personal. "I wanted to thank you for helping me with that shoulder opening sequence last week. I've been practicing it at home, and it's really helped with some tension I've been carrying." "That's wonderful to hear," I replied, suddenly very aware that we were standing closer than usual. Sometimes we hold stress in places we don't even realize until we start moving differently. "Exactly," he said, and then paused like he was deciding whether to say something else. "Lisa, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I've been wondering if you'd be interested in getting coffee sometime. Outside of class, I mean. As people, not as instructor and student." The question hung in the air between us like a yoga pose, held just a moment too long. My first instinct was to say no, to maintain boundaries, to keep things simple and safe. But something in his expression stopped me. There was vulnerability there, the kind that comes from someone who doesn't ask, casually and won't take rejection lightly. "I'd like that," I heard myself saying before my brain could interfere. "There's a great place called Mountain Roasters about 3 blocks from here. Are you free Saturday morning?" Mark's smile transformed his entire face. Saturday morning. Sounds perfect. As he left that night, I realized I was excited in a way I hadn't been in years. Not the nervous excitement of uncertainty, but the anticipatory joy of possibility. Jessica was going to be insufferably pleased with herself when I told her. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Colorado sunshine that makes everything feel possible. I chose my outfit carefully, settling on jeans and a blue sweater that brought out my eyes. At the last minute, I switched to a green top, then back to blue, then finally settled on a soft gray cardigan that felt like the perfect middle ground between trying too hard and not trying at all. Mountain Roasters was busy but not overwhelming, filled with the Saturday morning crowd of cyclists, dog walkers, and people catching up with friends. I spotted Mark at a corner table, and he stood when he saw me, a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and thoughtful. "You look lovely," he said as I approached, and the compliment felt genuine rather than obligatory. "Thank you," I replied, settling into the chair across from him. "This place has the best lavender lattes in Denver, if you're feeling adventurous." "Lavender lattes it is," he said, heading to the counter to order for both of us. Watching him interact with the barista, I noticed things I hadn't seen in our class interactions. The way he listened carefully to the menu options, asked about the origin of their coffee beans, thanked the staff by name after reading their name tags. There was a thoughtfulness to his presence that extended beyond our yoga studio. When he returned with our drinks, the conversation flowed with surprising ease. We talked about his work designing sustainable housing projects, my journey from corporate marketing to yoga instruction, our shared love of hiking Colorado's mountain trails. Mark told me about his recent divorce, finalized just over a year ago, and how yoga had been recommended by his therapist as a way to reconnect with his body and emotions after years of living in his head. "I was skeptical at first," he admitted, laughing. "The idea of stretching my way to emotional health seemed a little too California for a practical guy like me. But your classes aren't about perfection or performance. They're about showing up and being present, which was exactly what I needed to learn." I found myself sharing more than I intended about my own divorce, about the way it had shattered my confidence in my ability to read people and situations accurately, how yoga had become my way of rebuilding trust in my own intuition. "It's funny," Mark said, tracing the rim of his coffee cup with his finger. "I've spent my whole career designing spaces where people can feel safe and comfortable, but I forgot how to create that feeling in my own life until I started coming to your classes." There was something in the way he said it that made me look at him more closely. This wasn't just small talk or flattery. He was telling me that my teaching had meant something to him, had been part of his healing process. "That means more to me than you probably realize," I said softly. "Sometimes I wonder if what I'm doing matters, if people are really getting anything lasting from an hour of movement and breathing." "Trust me," Mark said, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my heart skip. "It matters. You matter." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but the weight of his words stayed with me. We discovered we both loved old movies, preferred hiking to crowded gyms, and had complicated relationships with our siblings who meant well, but offered too much unsolicited advice about our love lives. "My friend Robert has been trying to set me up with every single woman in Denver," Mark laughed. "He means well, but his idea of a perfect match is any woman who can tolerate his wife's book club discussions." "My sister Jessica has the subtlety of a real estate billboard when it comes to my dating life," I replied. "She's been dropping hints about you since she observed one of my classes last month." "She observed?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "Should I be flattered or terrified?" "Definitely flattered. Jessica's approval is harder to earn than a black belt in criticism." We spent nearly 3 hours at that coffee shop, and when Mark walked me to my car, there was a moment of hesitation that felt loaded with possibility. "I had a really wonderful time this morning," he said, standing just close enough that I could smell his cologne, something subtle and woodsy that suited him perfectly. "So did I replied, and meant it completely. "Would you be interested in doing this again? Maybe dinner next week?" "I'd love that," I said, and realized I genuinely would. As I drove home, I called Jessica immediately. "So?" she said, answering. On the first ring, like she'd been waiting by the phone. "So what?" I teased, though I was practically glowing. "Don't play dumb with me, Lisa Marie. How was coffee with Tuesday Night Blue shirt?" His name is Mark, and it was really nice. Really nice like he's pleasant company? Or really nice like I want to see him naked? Jessica, I laughed, nearly swerving into the wrong lane. That's not an answer, she sang. But your scandalized tone tells me everything I need to know. When's the second date? Dinner next week, I admitted. Perfect. Wear the blue dress. The one that makes you look like you could conquer the world and break hearts while doing it. After I hung up, I realized something had shifted in me during those 3 hours with Mark. The careful walls I'd built around my heart hadn't crumbled, but they definitely developed some strategic windows. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to finding out what might happen next. That Tuesday evening, Mark showed up to class wearing blue again, and this time I was certain it wasn't a coincidence. During Savasana, the final relaxation pose, I found myself stealing glances at his peaceful expression and wondering what he was thinking about. After class, he lingered while I put away props and turned off the sound system. About dinner, he said, approaching with that careful smile I was beginning to recognize as his way of testing the waters. I was thinking about that Italian place on Pearl Street. Thursday night, if that works for you? Thursday is perfect, I said, and realized I'd been hoping he'd bring it up. As the other students filed out, Mark moved closer, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me. Instead, he reached out and gently touched my arm. I'm really glad you said yes to coffee, he said quietly, and I'm really glad you're willing to say yes again. Me too, I whispered, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. As he left that night, I caught my reflection in the studio mirrors and was surprised by what I saw. The woman looking back at me had color in her cheeks, light in her eyes, and something that looked suspiciously like hope in her expression. I was 38 years old, a yoga instructor with a carefully rebuilt life, and a heart that was just beginning to remember how to trust again. And for the first time in years, I was excited to find out what came next. Thursday evening couldn't come fast enough. And yet when it arrived, I found myself changing clothes 3 times before settling on a navy blue dress that Jessica had insisted I buy months ago. It was simple but elegant, the kind of dress that made me feel confident without trying too hard. I paired it with my favorite silver earrings and a light jacket, telling myself this was just dinner between 2 adults who enjoyed each other's company. The Italian restaurant on Pearl Street was exactly the kind of place I loved, but rarely treated myself to. Warm lighting, exposed brick walls lined with wine bottles, and the kind of intimate atmosphere that encouraged long conversations. Mark was already seated when I arrived, and he stood immediately when he saw me approach. "You look stunning," he said, and the way he said it made me believe he meant it rather than just being polite. "Thank you," I replied, accepting the chair he pulled out for me. "This place is beautiful. How did you know about it?" "I designed the renovation 3 years ago," he said with a slight smile. "The owners wanted to maintain the historic character while creating better flow for service. It's one of my favorite projects because they really trusted the process." As we settled in and ordered wine, Mark told me more about his work. He specialized in sustainable residential design, creating homes that worked with Colorado's climate, rather than fighting against it. His passion for his craft was evident in the way he described projects, the challenges of working within historical preservation guidelines, the satisfaction of seeing families settle into spaces he'd helped create. "There's something magical about designing a space where people will build their lives," he said, his hands moving expressively as he talked. "You're not just arranging rooms and choosing materials. You're creating the backdrop for birthdays and holidays, quiet Sunday mornings and family dinners. That responsibility never gets old." I found myself drawn to his enthusiasm, the way his whole demeanor changed when he talked about work he loved. It reminded me of how I felt when discussing the transformative power of yoga, the way movement could shift not just physical tension, but emotional patterns that had been stuck for years. I feel the same way about teaching, I said, swirling the wine in my glass. People come to yoga thinking it's just about flexibility or stress relief. But what they're really seeking is connection. Connection to their bodies, to their breath, to some part of themselves they've lost touch with. Mark leaned forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on me. Tell me more about that. How did you make the transition from marketing to teaching? I paused, surprised by how much I wanted to share with him. Usually, the story of my career change felt too personal, too wrapped up in the painful details of my divorce and the identity crisis that followed. But with Mark, the words came easily. My marriage ended because I'd become someone I didn't recognize, I began slowly. I was working 60-hour weeks in marketing, trying to convince people they needed things they didn't actually want. My ex-husband was doing the same thing in his financial planning business. We were both so focused on achieving some version of success that we forgot to actually live our lives. Mark nodded, his expression understanding rather than judgmental. That sounds exhausting. It was. And when everything fell apart, I realized I hadn't taken a deep breath in years. Literally. I was holding my breath through my entire life, waiting for some moment when I could finally relax and be happy. A friend dragged me to a yoga class, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. The food arrived as I was speaking, and we continued talking between bites of perfectly prepared pasta and shared appetizers. Mark shared his own story of burnout, the way his first marriage had crumbled under the pressure of two people trying to build successful careers while forgetting to build a successful relationship. My ex-wife used to say I was married to my drafting table, he said with a rueful laugh. She wasn't wrong. I thought providing meant the same thing as loving. It took losing everything to realize that presence is more valuable than productivity. There was something deeply comfortable about the way we could discuss our failures without defensiveness or shame. We'd both been humbled by life, both learned that the things we thought mattered most could disappear overnight, leaving you with just yourself and the question of what to rebuild. Do you think we're more interesting people because of our mistakes? I asked, surprising myself with the philosophical turn. Mark considered this seriously, the way he seemed to consider all questions. I think we're more honest people, more willing to admit we don't have all the answers. That's probably more valuable than interesting. After dinner, we walked slowly through downtown Denver, neither of us seeming eager to end the evening. The spring air was crisp, but not cold, and the streets were busy with people enjoying the unusually warm weather. There's something I should probably tell you, Mark said as we paused outside a bookstore to look at the display in the window. I didn't start coming to your yoga class for the yoga. I turned to look at him, my heart doing something complicated in my chest. What do you mean? I mean, I saw you teaching through the glass doors one evening when I was dropping off my nephew after his basketball practice. You were demonstrating a pose, and there was something about the way you moved, the way you were completely present in your body, that stopped me in my tracks. I stood there for probably 10 minutes just watching. He paused, running a hand through his hair in what I was beginning to recognize as a nervous gesture. I told myself I was interested in trying yoga for stress relief. But really, I was interested in finding a reason to be in the same room as you for an hour every week. I felt my cheeks flush, partly from embarrassment and partly from something that felt dangerously close to joy. That's either very romantic or mildly stalkerish, I said, trying to lighten the moment. I prefer to think of it as extended reconnaissance, he replied with a grin. And for what it's worth, the yoga has been genuinely helpful. I just had additional motivation for showing up consistently. We continued walking, and I found myself processing this revelation. The careful way he positioned his mat for optimal viewing angles. The questions that seemed designed more to hear me talk than to gain information. The way he'd started wearing blue more frequently after I'd complimented his navy shirt during an adjustment. "So when you asked me for coffee," I said slowly, "that wasn't a spontaneous invitation." "It was spontaneous in the sense that I'd been building up courage for months and finally reached a tipping point," Mark admitted. "But no, the desire to ask you had been there for a while." I stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Mark, I need you to know something. I've been attracted to you since your third class, but I convinced myself it was inappropriate because you were my student. I've been fighting it for months." His smile was soft and relieved. "So we've both been idiots." "Apparently so." There was a moment of silence that felt charged with possibility. We were standing under a streetlight, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that it would be natural for him to kiss me. Instead, he reached out and gently touched my hand. "Lisa, I want you to know that I'm not looking for anything casual. I'm 45 years old, and I've learned that life is too short to waste time on connections that don't have the potential to be meaningful." His directness took my breath away. In my experience, men usually spent months dancing around their intentions, leaving women to decode mixed signals and read between lines. Mark's honesty felt like a gift. "I'm not looking for casual either," I said quietly. "But I'm also terrified of making another mistake. My judgment hasn't always been reliable when it comes to relationships." "Then we'll take it slow," he said simply. "We'll pay attention. We'll be honest about what we're feeling and what we need. And if we're making a mistake, at least we'll make it mindfully." I laughed at his use of yoga terminology, and the sound seemed to release some of the tension I'd been carrying. Mindful mistakes. I like that concept. When Mark walked me to my car, the goodbye felt different from the casual farewells after yoga class. There was weight to it, acknowledgement that something had shifted between us. He didn't try to kiss me, but he did lean down and kiss my cheek softly, letting his lips linger just long enough to make my pulse quicken. "Thank you for tonight," he said against my ear. "For dinner, for honesty, for giving this a chance." "Thank you for being patient," I replied, "for taking the time to really see me, even when I was trying to be invisible." Driving home, I felt like I was floating, slightly above my usual level of consciousness. The evening had been perfect in ways I hadn't expected. Not because everything went smoothly, but because we'd been real with each other. We'd acknowledged the messiness of our situations, the risks we were taking, the ways we'd both been hurt before. Jessica called just as I was getting ready for bed, her timing impeccable as always. "Well?" she demanded without preamble. "Well, what?" I asked, though I was smiling as I said it. "Don't play games with me, Lisa. How was dinner with the architect?" "His name is Mark, and it was wonderful." "Wonderful how? Wonderful like you want to see him again? Or wonderful like you want to marry him and have his babies?" "Jessica, I'm 38. The baby ship has probably sailed." That's not an answer to my question. I sank into my favorite armchair, still wearing my blue dress, and tried to find words for what I was feeling. It was wonderful, like I remembered why I used to believe in possibility. Like maybe being careful and being open don't have to be mutually exclusive. There was a pause on Jessica's end, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Lisa, that's the most hopeful thing I've heard you say in 3 years." "I know. It's terrifying. The best things usually are." After we hung up, I sat in my chair for a long time, thinking about the evening and what it might mean. Mark's honesty about why he'd started coming to my classes could have felt manipulative or calculating. Instead, it felt like someone had finally seen me clearly enough to make a deliberate choice about wanting to know me better. I thought about the way he'd described designing homes, creating spaces where families could build their lives. There was something metaphorical about that, about the idea of creating safe spaces where people could be fully themselves. Maybe that's what relationships were supposed to be. Architectural projects for the heart. The next morning brought my usual Saturday restorative yoga class, a slower-paced session focused on deep relaxation and gentle stretching. I found myself moving through the familiar routine with renewed energy, more present in my body than I'd been in months. After class, Patricia, our center manager, approached me with her usual post-workout glow and determination to stretch her boundaries beyond what her body naturally allowed. "Lisa, I have to ask," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Is there something different about you lately? You seem more radiant or something." I felt my cheeks warm. "Different how?" "I don't know. More alive, maybe. Your energy in class has been incredible the past few weeks. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." If Patricia had noticed a change, others probably had too. The thought made me simultaneously self-conscious and pleased. Maybe happiness was more visible than I'd realized. Maybe the careful walls I'd built hadn't just been protecting me from pain, but also preventing me from fully experiencing joy. Danny arrived for his kickboxing class setup, and his greeting confirmed Patricia's observation. "Well, well," he said, looking me up and down with exaggerated scrutiny. "Someone got laid last night." "Danny!" I gasped, looking around to make sure no lingering students had heard him. "Relax, the place is empty. But seriously, you're practically glowing. Please tell me Tuesday night blue shirt finally made his move." "We had dinner," I admitted, unable to suppress my smile. And it was really nice." Danny rolled his eyes. "You yoga people and your emotional constipation. Really nice. Could mean anything from pleasant conversation to best night of my life." "It means I'm hopeful," I said, surprising myself with the admission. For the first time in a long time, I'm actually hopeful about where something might lead. Danny's expression softened. He'd been working at the center longer than anyone and had witnessed my entire journey from the raw, newly divorced woman who'd started teaching as much for her own healing as for others. "You deserve that, Lisa. You deserve someone who sees how amazing you are and isn't intimidated by it." His words stayed with me through the weekend as I went about my usual routine of grocery shopping, laundry, and meal prep for the week. Ordinary tasks felt infused with possibility, like I was preparing not just for another week, but for a different version of my life. Mark texted on Sunday afternoon, a simple message that managed to be both casual and thoughtful. "Hope you're having a relaxing weekend. Looking forward to seeing you Tuesday evening." I stared at the message for several minutes before responding. "Weekend has been lovely. See you Tuesday." It was a small exchange, but it felt significant. The acknowledgement that we were both thinking about each other, both anticipating our next interaction. The way he'd said "seeing you" rather than "class" suggested he was thinking of me as more than just his instructor. Tuesday evening arrived with spring rain that made everything smell fresh and clean. I chose my outfit more carefully than usual, settling on black leggings and a soft blue top that brought out my eyes. As students began filtering into the studio, I found myself watching the door with an awareness that felt both exciting and slightly unprofessional. Mark arrived right on time, as always, but tonight there was something different about his energy. He smiled when he saw me, not the polite smile of a student greeting an instructor, but the warm, knowing smile of someone who was genuinely happy to see me. "Good evening, Lisa," he said, and the way he said my name made my stomach flutter. "Good evening, Mark," I replied, hoping my voice sounded more professional than I felt. As class began, I was hyper-aware of his presence in a way that was both distracting and energizing. During Downward Dog, I found myself stealing glances at his form, admiring the strength in his shoulders and the way he breathed steadily through challenging poses. When I walked around offering adjustments, The brief contact of my hands on his back during a twist sent electricity through my fingertips. After class, as students were rolling up their mats and gathering their belongings, Mark approached me with that careful deliberation I'd come to recognize. "Wonderful class tonight," he said, but there was something in his tone that suggested he wanted to say more. "Thank you," I replied, suddenly nervous about what might come next. "Lisa, I was wondering if you'd be interested in going for a hike this weekend. There's a trail in Golden that's supposed to have incredible views of the Front Range." The invitation felt like a natural progression, a way to spend time together that aligned with our shared love of Colorado's outdoor spaces. "I'd love that," I said, meaning it completely. "Saturday morning? I could pick you up around 8, and we could grab coffee on the way." "Perfect," I agreed, already mentally planning what to wear for a mountain hike with a man I was rapidly developing serious feelings for. As Mark left that evening, he paused at the door and turned back toward me. "Lisa," he said quietly, "I know this is all new, and I don't want to pressure you or make things complicated. But I want you to know that I think about you a lot more than just on Tuesday evenings." His honesty took my breath away again. "I think about you too," I admitted. "More than I probably should." "Then maybe we should stop pretending this is just about yoga and coffee dates," he said with a smile that made my heart race. "Maybe we should," I agreed, feeling like I was standing at the edge of something beautiful and terrifying. As I locked up the studio that night, I caught my reflection in the dark windows and saw a woman who looked different from the careful, controlled person I'd been for the past 3 years. This woman had color in her cheeks, light in her eyes, and something that looked suspiciously like hope in her expression. I was 38 years old, a yoga instructor who'd built a safe life from the ashes of a painful divorce. And for the first time since then, I was ready to risk that safety for the possibility of something real. Saturday morning dawned with the kind of crystalline Colorado sky that made everything feel possible. I woke before my alarm, which was unusual for someone who treasured weekend sleep, but excitement had apparently reset my internal clock. I dressed in layers, knowing that mountain weather could shift from warm to chilly without warning, and chose hiking boots that were broken in but still made my legs look good. Mark arrived precisely at 8, looking ruggedly handsome in worn jeans and a forest green fleece that brought out the deeper tones in his brown eyes. He'd brought travel mugs of coffee from Mountain Roasters, remembering my preference for their lavender blend without my having to ask. "You look ready for adventure," he said, his gaze appreciating my hiking attire in a way that made me feel simultaneously outdoorsy and attractive. "I've been looking forward to this all week," I admitted as we loaded my small backpack into his truck, a well-maintained Ford that smelled like leather and pine air freshener. The drive to Golden gave us time to talk without the structured environment of a restaurant or the professional boundaries of the yoga studio. Mark told me about his nephew's basketball team, how he'd volunteered to help with some fundraising by designing a small addition to their community center. I shared stories about my most challenging yoga students, including a retired judge who insisted on correcting everyone else's poses despite being unable to touch his own toes. "There's something I should warn you about," Mark said as we turned into the trailhead parking area. "I'm one of those people who gets very focused when hiking. I tend to notice every plant, every rock formation, every architectural detail of the landscape. Some people find it annoying. I'm one of those people who talks through most physical activities," I replied. "It helps me process thoughts and emotions. Some people find that annoying too. So we're perfectly matched in our potential to irritate each other," he laughed, parking the truck near a cluster of pine trees that provided natural shade. The trail started with a gentle incline through stands of aspen and evergreen, the kind of Colorado landscape that appeared on postcards, but somehow never captured the way the thin mountain air made every breath feel intentional. Mark had been right about his tendency to notice details. He pointed out architectural elements in the way rocks had naturally formed retaining walls, how indigenous peoples had likely used certain clearings for seasonal camps, the engineering genius of beaver. Dams we glimpsed through the trees. You see the whole landscape as a design project, I observed as we paused to drink water and admire a particularly spectacular view of the Front Range. Everything is design, Mark replied, his eyes scanning the horizon with professional appreciation. Nature just does it better than humans most of the time. Look at how these rock formations create natural windbreaks for those wildflowers. Perfect placement, perfect proportions, perfect function. I found myself watching him as much as the scenery, fascinated by the way his mind worked, where I experienced the mountains emotionally, feeling connected to something larger than myself. Mark experienced them intellectually and aesthetically, seeing patterns and systems and solutions. "What do you see when you look out there?" he asked, genuinely curious about my perspective. I considered the question seriously, wanting to give him something as thoughtful as his observations. "I see breath," I said finally. "The way the wind moves through the valleys like the earth is doing pranayama, conscious breathing. The rhythm of seasons, the way everything expands and contracts in cycles. It reminds me that change isn't something to resist, but something to flow with." Mark smiled, and I could see him trying to understand my more intuitive way of processing the landscape. "That's beautiful," he said. "I've never thought about geography as having breath." We continued climbing, the conversation shifting between deeper topics and comfortable silence. Mark told me about his ex-wife, how their relationship had ended not in dramatic conflict, but in a slow recognition that they'd grown into incompatible people. I shared more about my divorce, the way my ex-husband's criticism had gradually eroded my confidence until I'd stopped trusting my own instincts about almost everything. "The hardest part wasn't the logistics of divorce," I said as we navigated a particularly rocky section of trail. "It was learning to trust myself again, to believe that my feelings were valid, that my perceptions were accurate. Yoga helped with that, the way it requires you to listen to your body and honor what it's telling you." "I can relate to that," Mark said, offering his hand to help me over a fallen log. "I spent years designing spaces other people wanted instead of spaces that felt authentic to me. When my marriage ended, I realized I'd been living in emotional architecture that didn't fit who I actually was." The metaphor struck me as perfect. We'd both been living in structures that looked acceptable from the outside, but felt constricting from within. Now, we were both in the process of rebuilding, trying to create lives that felt genuinely inhabitable. After 2 hours of steady climbing, we reached a lookout point that offered panoramic views of the Denver metro area spread out below us like a detailed map. The sight took my breath away, not just because of the physical beauty, but because of the perspective it provided. From this height, the problems and complications of daily life seemed manageable, temporary, part of a much larger pattern. "This is why I love Colorado," Mark said, settling onto a sun-warmed boulder and pulling sandwiches from his pack. "You can drive an hour from the city and feel like you're in a completely different world." "It puts things in perspective," I agreed, accepting the sandwich he offered. Turkey and avocado on sourdough, exactly what I would have chosen for myself. We ate in comfortable silence, both of us absorbed in the view and the satisfaction of physical exertion. There was something deeply peaceful about sharing space without feeling the need to fill it with conversation. Mark's presence felt easy, undemanding, like sitting with someone who didn't need me to be anything other than exactly who I was. "Lisa," he said eventually, his tone shifting to something more serious, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," I replied, though I felt a flutter of nervousness about what might be coming. "What are you afraid of? I mean, specifically about this, about us." The question caught me off guard with its directness. but I appreciated his willingness to address what we'd both been dancing around. I took a long drink of water, buying time to formulate an honest answer. "I'm afraid of being wrong again," I said slowly. "I'm afraid that my judgment is still compromised from my divorce, that I'm seeing things I want to see rather than things that are actually there. I'm afraid of investing emotionally in someone who might decide I'm not worth the effort." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Those are reasonable fears. What would help you feel more confident about your judgment?" "Time, I suppose. Consistency. Seeing how you handle stress or disappointment or conflict. My ex-husband was charming and attentive when everything was going well, but he became cruel when life got difficult." "I appreciate your honesty," Mark said. "For what it's worth, I don't think your judgment is compromised. I think it's more careful than it used to be, which is probably healthy." He paused, looking out at the landscape before continuing. "I'm afraid too, if that helps. I'm afraid of rushing into something because I'm lonely, rather than because it's genuinely right. I'm afraid of being so focused on not making my previous mistakes that I make entirely new ones." His vulnerability touched something deep in my chest. Here was a man who could acknowledge his fears without letting them paralyze him, who could be honest about his uncertainties without expecting me to provide all the answers. "So, what do we do with our fears?" I asked. "We pay attention to them, without letting them make all our decisions," he replied. "We take things slow enough to notice red flags, but not so slow that we talk ourselves out of something good." The conversation felt like a clearing of the air, an acknowledgement of the emotional complexity we were both navigating. As we packed up our lunch and prepared for the descent, I felt a sense of relief. We weren't pretending this was simple or guaranteed. We were both aware of the risks and choosing to proceed anyway. The hike down was easier on our lungs but harder, on our knees, requiring more attention to foot placement and less opportunity for extended conversation. Mark proved to be a considerate hiking partner, alerting me to loose rocks or tricky footing without being patronizing about it. As we reached the parking area, both of us were pleasantly tired and slightly sunburned despite our careful application of sunscreen. The afternoon had developed the kind of late spring warmth that made you want to linger outdoors. "Are you hungry for an early dinner?" Mark asked as we loaded our gear back into his truck. "There's a great Mexican place in Golden that has an outdoor patio." "That sounds perfect," I replied, realizing I was reluctant for the day to end. The restaurant was exactly the kind of place I loved but rarely visited alone. Casual but not cheap, busy but not chaotic, with the kind of atmosphere that encouraged lingering over food and conversation. We claimed a table on the patio under a string of lights that weren't yet illuminated, but suggested the possibility of magic after dark. Over margaritas and shared plates of guacamole and quesadillas, our conversation took on a different quality than it had during the hike. The physical exertion and mountain air had left us both relaxed and slightly uninhibited. "I have a confession," Mark said, his finger tracing the rim of his margarita glass. "I've been strategically choosing my yoga attire based on what I think you like." I nearly choked on my drink. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I noticed you always seem to compliment students wearing blue, so I've been wearing blue to class more often than any heterosexual man probably should." The admission was so endearingly ridiculous that I burst into laughter. "Mark, I compliment blue because it's my favorite color, not because I'm trying to send secret messages to my students." "Your favorite color," he repeated, looking pleased with this information. "Good to know." "Although now that you mention it," I said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "I did notice you seem to be wearing blue more frequently. I thought it was coincidence." "Strategic wardrobe planning," he grinned. "I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed either." The conversation continued to flow as easily as the drinks, touching on everything from childhood memories to travel dreams to the books that had shaped our thinking. Mark told me about his desire to design affordable housing that didn't sacrifice beauty for economy. I shared my dream of eventually opening a retreat center where people could combine yoga practice with outdoor adventure. "That sounds amazing," Mark said, his eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "Have you thought about location? What kind of architecture would support that vision?" "I've always imagined something in the mountains," I said, surprised by how good it felt to voice my dream out loud. "Simple buildings that don't compete with the natural beauty. Lots of windows, natural materials, spaces that flow between indoor and outdoor practice areas." "I'd love to see your ideas sketched out sometime," Mark said. "I bet you have better instincts about spatial design than you realize." As the sun began to set, the patio lights came on, and the restaurant filled with couples and families enjoying Saturday evening. Watching them, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't experienced in years. Not just belonging to a place, but belonging with someone. "This has been a perfect day," I said, meaning it completely. "It really has," Mark agreed. "Thank you for saying yes to the hike, and to dinner, and to giving this whole thing a chance." "Thank you for being patient with my fears and neuroses," I replied, "and for wearing blue to yoga class." We lingered over dessert and coffee, neither of us eager to return to our separate homes and separate lives. When Mark finally suggested we should probably head back to Denver, it was fully dark and the restaurant was beginning to empty. The drive home was quieter than the morning trip, both of us processing the day and what it had meant. Mark's truck, radio played soft rock from the 90s, the kind of music that felt like a soundtrack to the comfortable intimacy we'd developed. When he walked me to my door, the moment felt weighted with possibility. We'd spent 10 hours together, shared, meals and conversation and physical adventure. We'd been honest about our fears and hopes. We'd moved beyond the careful politeness of early dating into something that felt real and substantial. "Lisa," Mark said as we stood on my front porch, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with mountain air and sunshine. "I know. We agreed to take things slow, but I really want to kiss you right now." His directness made my heart race. "I really want you to kiss me too," I admitted. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, a gentle exploration rather than a passionate declaration. But as I responded, pressing closer to him, it deepened into something that felt like a promise. His hands came up to cup my face, and I could feel the calluses on his fingers from years of working with his hands. When we broke apart, both of us were breathing a little harder than the kiss alone warranted. "That was worth waiting for," Mark said softly, his forehead resting against mine. "Much better than I imagined," I replied, then immediately blushed at the admission that I'd been imagining it. "You've been imagining kissing me?" he asked with a grin that suggested he was pleased rather than surprised. "Possibly," I said, trying to maintain some dignity while standing in the circle of his arms. "Good," he said simply, "because I've been imagining kissing you since about your third class." We stood there for several more minutes, reluctant to end the physical contact that felt so natural and right. Eventually, practical considerations intruded, and Mark stepped back with obvious reluctance. "I should probably go," he said, "but I'm hoping I can see you again soon." "Outside of yoga class, I mean." "You definitely can," I assured him. "In fact, you definitely should." As I watched him drive away, I felt like I was glowing from the inside out. The day had been perfect, not because nothing had gone wrong, but because everything had felt authentic. We'd been ourselves with each other, fears and hopes and silly confessions included. Inside my apartment, I called Jessica immediately, needing to share the day with someone who would understand its significance. "Well," she said, answering on the first ring as usual. "Well, I think I'm falling for him," I said without preamble. "About time," Jessica laughed. "Tell me everything." I recounted the day in detail, from the morning coffee to the mountain. Views to the goodnight kiss that had left me feeling dizzy with possibility. "Lisa," Jessica said when I finished, her voice unusually serious. "You sound different. You sound like yourself again, but better. Happier." "I feel different," I admitted. "Like I'm remembering how to be excited about the future instead of just grateful for safety." "That's huge," Jessica said. "And this Mark guy sounds like he's worth the risk." After we hung up, I got ready for bed with a lightness in my step that felt foreign after years of careful routine. As I brushed my teeth, I caught myself smiling at my reflection, remembering the way Mark had looked at me when he said he wanted to kiss me. I was 38 years old, a yoga instructor who'd spent 3 years rebuilding her life after a painful divorce. And for the first time since then, I was allowing myself to believe that the best parts of my story might still be unwritten. The weeks following our mountain adventure settled into a rhythm that felt both thrilling and comfortable. Mark continued attending my Tuesday yoga classes, but now our interactions carried the weight of shared secrets and stolen glances. We managed to maintain professionalism during class time, though I caught him smiling at me during particularly challenging poses in ways that made my concentration waver. Our relationship began to weave itself into the fabric of ordinary life. Friday evening dinners became a tradition, sometimes at restaurants, sometimes cooking together in my kitchen, or his. Saturday mornings often found us exploring different hiking trails throughout the Front Range, each adventure revealing new layers of compatibility and attraction. Mark proved to be exactly what he'd advertised himself as during our first serious conversation. He was consistent, thoughtful, and present in ways my ex-husband had never been. When I had a particularly difficult day dealing with a demanding student who questioned every instruction I gave, Mark listened without trying to fix the situation, offering exactly the kind of support I needed. "Some people come to yoga to find peace," he said as we walked through my neighborhood after I'd vented about the challenging class. "Others come to yoga to spread their chaos around. You can't be responsible for their journey, only for showing up authentically to yours." His words had a way of cutting through my tendency to overthink and second-guess myself. Where my ex-husband had amplified my insecurities, Mark seemed to naturally calm them. Jessica met Mark for the first time 6 weeks into our relationship, ambushing us at a coffee shop where she happened to be meeting a client. Her evaluation was swift and decisive. "I like him," she announced later that evening when she called for her full report. "He looks at you like you're fascinating rather than convenient, and he didn't try to dominate the conversation or prove how important he is. Those are good signs." Coming from Jessica, whose standards for men had only gotten higher since her own divorce 2 years earlier, this constituted a ringing endorsement. Danny's approval came more gradually, but was equally meaningful. Mark started arriving at the community center a few minutes early for my Tuesday classes, which meant he often encountered Danny setting up for his own sessions. Their conversations began with polite small talk about fitness and evolved into genuine friendship. "Your architect understands that being supportive doesn't mean being possessive," Danny observed one evening as we cleaned the studios together. "He asks about your work because he's genuinely interested, not because he's keeping tabs on you. That's rarer than it should be." The community center became a natural testing ground for how Mark fit into my established life. Patricia, our perpetually curious manager, was initially skeptical of any romantic involvement that might complicate the professional atmosphere she worked hard to maintain. But Mark's respectful behavior and obvious positive effect on my teaching eventually won her over. "I don't usually approve of workplace romances," she told me after watching Mark help organize equipment after a particularly busy evening. "But you two seem to bring out the best in each other rather than creating drama. Just keep it professional during work hours." Mark's integration into my world felt seamless, but introducing him to the deeper complexities of my life proved more challenging. My parents, who lived in Fort Collins and maintained strong opinions about my romantic choices, had been skeptical of anyone I dated since my divorce. When I finally arranged for them to meet Mark over brunch at their favorite restaurant, I was more nervous than I'd been since our first coffee date. My mother, a retired teacher with an uncanny ability to detect insincerity, spent the first hour of the meal asking pointed questions about Mark's career, his previous marriage, and his long-term intentions. "Mom," I finally interjected when her interrogation began to resemble a job interview. "Mark isn't on trial here. Anyone who wants to date my daughter is absolutely on trial," my mother replied without apology. "Lisa's happiness is not negotiable." To his credit, Mark handled my mother's protective intensity with patience and humor. He answered her questions honestly, shared stories about his work that demonstrated his values, and asked thoughtful questions about their lives and experiences. The turning point came when my father, usually quiet during family gatherings, began discussing his frustration with a contractor who was renovating their kitchen. Mark listened carefully, then offered specific suggestions about building codes and design solutions that could resolve the ongoing problems. "You seem to know what you're talking about," my father said, which constituted high praise from a man who'd spent 40 years in construction management. By the end of brunch, my mother was showing Mark photos on her phone of various home improvement projects she and my father were considering. Her approval, while not explicitly stated, was clear in her invitation for him to join our family's annual camping trip to Rocky Mountain National Park. The camping trip, scheduled for late July, represented a significant milestone in our relationship. 4 days in close quarters with my extended family would test the durability of our connection in ways that romantic dinners and mountain hikes could not. Mark approached the trip with the same thoughtful preparation he brought to everything else, researching the campground, suggesting hiking routes, and offering to contribute specific gear and cooking responsibilities. His enthusiasm for outdoor adventure aligned perfectly with my family's traditions, and I found myself imagining him becoming a permanent part of these annual gatherings. But as July approached, complications began to emerge that tested the solid foundation we'd been building. Mark's ex-wife, Sarah, reappeared in his life with requests for help with property issues related to their divorce settlement. What started as occasional phone calls about paperwork evolved into more frequent contact about various emergencies and crises. "She's struggling," Mark explained after spending an entire Saturday helping Sarah deal with a flooded basement in the house they'd once shared. "I know it's complicated, but I can't just ignore someone who was part of my life for 12 years. I understood his position intellectually, but emotionally I found myself wrestling with insecurity and jealousy. I thought I'd moved beyond. Sarah's needs seemed to escalate whenever Mark and I had plans together, and I began to suspect her crises were more manipulative than genuine. The situation came to a head the week before our camping trip. Mark had to cancel our Friday dinner because Sarah's car had broken down and she needed transportation to a family emergency. When he called to explain, I could hear her voice in the background, and something about her tone suggested she was aware of the disruption she was causing. "Lisa, I'm sorry," Mark said, his own frustration evident. "I know this isn't fair to you, but I can't abandon her when she really needs help." "I understand," I said, though I wasn't sure I actually did. "We can reschedule." After we hung up, I found myself spiraling into the kind of overthinking that had characterized my worst moments during my divorce. Was Mark's loyalty to his ex-wife a sign of unresolved feelings? Was I being unreasonable to expect him to prioritize our relationship? Were the patterns of abandonment and betrayal from my marriage repeating themselves with someone I'd believed was different? Jessica found me Saturday morning sitting in my kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I wrestled with my thoughts. "You look like someone died," she said, helping herself to coffee and settling across from me at the small table where Mark and I had shared so many meals. "I think I'm sabotaging something good because I'm scared it's too good to be true," I admitted, grateful for her direct approach to emotional crisis. "Tell me what happened." I explained the situation with Sarah, my growing resentment about canceled plans, and my fear that Mark's continued involvement with his ex-wife indicated problems I was choosing to ignore. Jessica listened without interruption, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "Have you talked to Mark about how this makes you feel?" "I don't want to be the jealous girlfriend who demands he cut contact with his ex-wife," I said. "That would make me exactly the kind of person I don't want to be." "Being honest about your feelings doesn't make you controlling," Jessica replied. "It makes you human. Mark can't address concerns he doesn't know you have." Her words echoed something Mark himself had said during our mountain hike about paying attention to fears without letting them make all our decisions. I realized I'd been so focused on not repeating the mistakes of my previous relationship that I was creating new problems through avoidance and assumption. That evening, I texted Mark asking if we could talk. He called immediately, his voice concerned when he heard the serious tone in my message. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "I need to be honest with you about something," I said, my heart racing with the vulnerability of what I was about to share. "The situation with Sarah is making me uncomfortable, and I need to understand what role she's going to play in your life going forward." There was a pause that felt eternal before Mark responded. "You're absolutely right to bring this up, and I'm sorry I haven't been more aware of how this affects you. Can we talk in person? Tonight?" An hour later, Mark was sitting in my living room, his expression serious and his full attention focused on the conversation we both knew was overdue. "First," he said, "I want you to know that there are no unresolved romantic feelings between Sarah and me. Our marriage ended because we grew into incompatible people, and that hasn't changed." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "But you're right that I've been handling her requests for help without considering how they impact you and our relationship. That's not fair, and it's not sustainable." Mark went on to explain that Sarah had been struggling with depression since their divorce and had few other people in her life to call for support. His sense of responsibility for her well-being, while admirable, had prevented him from establishing appropriate boundaries. "What would healthy boundaries look like?" I asked, grateful for his willingness to address the issue directly. "Emergency situations only," he said without hesitation, "and clear communication with you about what's happening and why I'm choosing to help. Your comfort and our relationship have to be the priority." The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering not just the immediate issue, but broader questions about how we would handle challenges and conflicts in the future. Mark's willingness to examine his behavior and adjust it demonstrated the kind of emotional maturity I'd been hoping to find in a partner. "I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between being a good person and being a good partner," I said as our discussion wound down. "But I need to know that our relationship is your priority when those two things seem to conflict." "Our relationship is my priority," Mark said firmly, "and I'll do better at showing that through my actions, not just my words." The camping trip with my family proceeded without drama from Sarah or anyone else. Mark proved to be exactly the kind of addition to our group I'd hoped he would be. Helpful without being intrusive, sociable without dominating conversations, and genuinely interested in the people who mattered to me. Watching him teach my teenage nephew some basic principles of outdoor photography, while my father showed him the intricacies of camp cooking, I felt a sense of rightness that went beyond romantic attraction. Mark fit into the fabric of my life in ways that felt natural and sustainable. On the final evening of the trip, as we sat around the campfire sharing stories and watching stars emerge in the clear mountain air, my mother pulled me aside for one of her characteristically direct conversations. "I like this one," she said, simply. "He sees you, Lisa. Really sees you. And he doesn't seem intimidated by what he sees." "I like him too," I replied, understating the depth of my feelings in the way children do with parents who already know the truth. "Good," my mother said. "You deserve someone who appreciates what a gift you are." As summer turned toward autumn, Mark and I settled into patterns that felt both exciting and comfortable. We talked daily, whether in person or by phone. We planned weekend adventures and quiet evenings with equal enthusiasm. We met each other's friends and family and began to build the kind of integrated social life that indicated serious commitment. The pivotal moment I'd been unconsciously waiting for came on a Tuesday evening in early October. I'd taught my usual class, which Mark attended as always, and was packing up my equipment while students filtered out of the studio. Patricia had announced earlier that week that the community center would be expanding its programming to include weekend retreats, and she'd asked if I would be interested in developing and leading these programs. The opportunity represented everything I'd dreamed of professionally: a chance to combine yoga instruction with outdoor adventure, to create the kind of transformative experiences that had drawn me to teaching in the first place. But the position would require significant travel on weekends, the very time Mark and I had been spending together exploring Colorado and deepening our relationship. I'd been wrestling with the decision all week, torn between professional fulfillment and personal happiness. As I finished organizing props and turned off the studio lights, I realized Mark was still there, sitting quietly on his folded mat and watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're thinking about the retreat position," he said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" I asked, surprised by his perceptiveness. "Because you get this look when you're processing big decisions, like you're trying to solve a complex equation that involves your heart and your head and your fears all at the same time." His observation was so accurate it made me laugh despite my anxiety about the conversation we were about to have. "I want the position," I admitted, sitting down on my own mat facing him. "But I'm scared about what it might mean for us. We've just found our rhythm, and now I'm considering something that would change everything." Mark was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than reactive. "Lisa," he said finally, "what made you fall in love with yoga in the first place?" The question caught me off guard, but I found myself answering honestly. The way it made me feel connected to something larger than my own fears and limitations. The way it taught me that I was stronger and more flexible than I'd believed. "And what made you want to teach?" "The possibility of helping other people discover that same sense of expansion and possibility." Mark smiled, and I could see where he was leading the conversation. "Then you already know what you need to do," he said gently. "You need to take the position, not despite our relationship, but because of what you've learned about yourself through our relationship." I felt tears prick my eyes, moved by his immediate support for my professional dreams. "But what about us?" I asked. "What about our weekends together, our hiking trips, all the time we've been spending building this thing between us?" Mark reached across the space between our mats and took my hands in his. "Lisa, I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure out how to make it work because what we have is worth figuring out. Your growth and happiness aren't threats to our relationship. They're part of what makes you the person I'm falling in love with." The words "falling in love with" hung in the air between us. The first time either of us had used that phrase directly. "You're falling in love with me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been falling in love with you since that first coffee date," Mark admitted. "Maybe since the first time you adjusted my downward dog and I realized you were paying attention to me as more than just another student." I felt my heart expand in my chest, a sensation that was both thrilling and terrifying. "I'm falling in love with you too," I said, the admission feeling like jumping off a cliff and sprouting wings simultaneously. We sat there in the empty studio, holding hands and grinning at each other like teenagers who'd just discovered kissing. "So we're doing this?" I asked. "The retreat position, the travel, the logistics of loving each other while pursuing our individual dreams." "We're doing this," Mark confirmed. "All of it." 3 months later, I was leading my first weekend retreat in Estes Park, guiding a group of 12 people through morning yoga practices that flowed into afternoon hikes, through landscapes that, took everyone's breath away. Mark had driven up Saturday evening after finishing a client presentation, arriving just as we were gathering around a fire pit for evening meditation. Watching him quietly find a place in our circle, seeing the way he naturally integrated into the group I was leading, I felt a sense of completion I'd never experienced before. This was what I'd been moving toward without knowing it. A life that included meaningful work, authentic relationships, and the kind of love that supported growth rather than demanding sacrifice. After the retreat, participants had settled into their cabins for the night. Mark and I walked to a ridge overlooking the valley where scattered lights twinkled like earthbound stars. "How does it feel?" he asked, his arm around my shoulders as we stood in the crisp mountain air. "Like everything I didn't know I was looking for," I replied, leaning into his warmth. "The retreat or us?" "Both," I said, turning to face him. "All of it." In the moonlight, I could see Mark's expression clearly, the way he was looking at me with a mixture of love and admiration that still made my breath catch. "I have something to tell you," I said, suddenly remembering a conversation from earlier in the day that I'd been saving to share with him. "What's that?" One of the retreat participants, Margaret, the woman from Boulder who's been divorced for 5 years. She told me during our hike that watching us together gave her hope that it was possible to find love again after 40. Mark smiled, his hand coming up to cup my cheek. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that the best things happen when you're brave enough to show up as yourself and patient enough to wait for someone who sees that as a gift rather than a project to fix." "Wise advice," Mark said, leaning down to kiss me softly. As we made our way back toward the retreat center, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 2 people who'd been broken by previous relationships, who'd approached love again with appropriate caution and hard-earned wisdom. We'd taken our time, been honest about our fears, and chosen each other despite the risks. I was 38 years old, a yoga instructor building the career of my dreams, with a man who loved me enough to encourage my growth rather than contain it. We weren't perfect people living a perfect love story. We were real people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment when we were both ready to be brave enough for love that demanded authenticity rather than performance. The next morning, as I led the final yoga session of the retreat, I found myself surrounded by faces that reflected the same sense of possibility I felt in my own life. These people had come seeking something they couldn't quite name, and they were leaving with tools for creating the changes they needed to make. After the participants departed and we'd cleaned up the retreat space, Mark and I drove back toward Denver through mountain scenery that seemed to glow with autumn light. The radio played softly, and our conversation moved easily between plans for the coming week and dreams for the future. "Lisa," Mark said as we descended into the foothills, "I have something I want to ask you." Something in his tone made me look at him more closely, noting the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he was nervous about whatever was coming. "What is it?" "Not while I'm driving," he said with a smile that was both mysterious and reassuring. "But soon. Very soon." I felt a flutter of anticipation that stayed with me through the rest of the drive, through the process of unpacking and settling back into ordinary life, through the evening routine we'd developed of cooking dinner together while sharing the details of our days. It wasn't until we were cleaning up after dinner, moving around each other in my kitchen with the comfortable efficiency of people who'd learned each other's rhythms, that Mark brought up whatever he'd been wanting to discuss. "Lisa," he said, setting down the dish towel and turning to face me fully. "I know we've been taking things slow, being careful not to rush into anything based on emotions rather than genuine compatibility." I nodded, my heart starting to race, with anticipation of where this conversation might be headed. "But I think we've had enough time to know that what we have is real and sustainable and worth building a future around." Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that made my breath catch in my throat. "I'm not asking you to marry me tonight," he said quickly, seeing my expression. "But I'm asking if you'd be willing to wear this as a promise. that we're moving in that direction. A promise that we're choosing each other, not just for right now, but for all the adventures and challenges and ordinary Tuesday evenings that are still ahead of us. He opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful ring with a single stone that caught the kitchen light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. "It's a sapphire," he said, his voice slightly nervous. "Your favorite color. I had it made by a jeweler here in Denver, someone who specializes in sustainable stones and ethical sourcing." I stared at the ring, overwhelmed by its beauty and by the thoughtfulness that had gone into choosing it. But more than that, I was overwhelmed by the man standing in front of me, offering me not just jewelry, but a future built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the kind of love that made both people better versions of themselves. "Mark," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "are you asking me to be engaged? To be engaged?" "I'm asking you to be my partner in every sense of the word," he replied. "In work and play, in adventure and routine, in all the ways two people can choose to build a life together." I looked at him standing in my kitchen, this man who'd first appeared in my yoga class and slowly revealed himself to be everything I hadn't dared to hope for. He was offering me a promise ring like we were teenagers, and somehow that felt exactly right for where we were in our relationship. "Yes," I said, extending my left hand toward him. "Yes to the ring. Yes to the promise. Yes to all of it." As Mark slipped the ring onto my finger, I thought about the moment that had started everything between us. A simple comment about favorite colors, spoken by a woman who'd finally learned to be brave enough to reach for what she wanted. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for my finger all along. Looking at it, I could see our future, stretching ahead of us. More retreats and adventures, the integration of our professional lives, the possibility of the retreat center I'd dreamed of creating, maybe even the sustainable housing projects Mark envisioned building. "How does it feel?" Mark asked, his hands holding mine as we both admired the ring. "Like coming home," I said, and meant it completely. We stood there in my kitchen, two people who'd been brave enough to love again after being broken, who'd been patient enough to build something real despite the risks. The ring caught the light and threw it back in tiny rainbows, a perfect metaphor for the way love could transform ordinary moments into something luminous and lasting. I was 38 years old, wearing a promise ring from a man who loved me enough to encourage my dreams while building new ones together. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I was younger, but it was exactly the life I'd learned to want: authentic, adventurous, and anchored in the kind of love that made everything else possible. 6 months after Mark slipped that sapphire promise ring onto my finger, our lives had woven together in ways that felt both natural and miraculous. The retreat program I'd developed had grown beyond anything Patricia or I had initially envisioned. Word spread through Denver's wellness community about the transformative weekend experiences we offered, combining yoga practice with Colorado's stunning outdoor environments. Mark had become my unofficial business partner, contributing architectural insights that enhanced every aspect of the retreats. He designed portable shade structures that could be assembled quickly at any location, creating intimate spaces for meditation even in the most exposed mountain settings. His understanding of how physical spaces affected emotional experiences proved invaluable as we refined the program's offerings. The success of the retreats led to an unexpected opportunity that would test our relationship in ways we hadn't anticipated. A wellness resort in Costa Rica reached out through a mutual contact, offering me a 6-month residency to develop their yoga and adventure programming. The position would involve designing experiences for international guests while training local instructors in trauma-informed teaching methods. "It's everything you've been working toward," Mark said when I showed him the official offer letter that arrived on a Thursday morning in March. We were sitting in his kitchen, sharing coffee and the kind of leisurely breakfast that had become our weekday ritual. "It's everything I've been working toward professionally," I corrected, studying his expression for signs of the anxiety I was feeling. but it would mean 6 months apart, just when we're building something real together. Mark set down his coffee cup and reached across the table to take my hands. The promise ring caught the morning light streaming through his kitchen windows, the same windows he'd designed to capture optimal sunrise illumination. Lisa, when I gave you that ring, I promised to support your growth as a person and a professional. This opportunity is exactly the kind of growth I was talking about. His immediate support should have relieved my anxiety, but instead it triggered a deeper fear I'd been avoiding. What if I go to Costa Rica and discover I don't want to come back? What if 6 months of independence makes me realize I don't actually want to build a life with someone else? The question hung between us like a challenge neither of us had expected. Mark was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand while he processed what I'd asked. Then that would be important information for both of us to have, he said finally. Lisa, I'm not trying to lock you into a decision you made 6 months ago. I'm trying to love you enough to let you discover who you're becoming. His response was so mature, so fundamentally secure, that it made me want to cry. This was what real love looked like, I realized. Not the desperate clinging I'd mistaken for commitment in my first marriage, but the confident generosity of someone who trusted both himself and me enough to risk temporary separation for long-term growth. I'm scared, I admitted, voicing the vulnerability I'd been trying to manage alone. Of what specifically? Of losing you. Of losing us. Of discovering that what we have isn't as strong as I think it is. Mark lifted our joined hands and kissed my knuckles gently. What we have has survived Sarah's drama, your family's scrutiny, the integration of 2 previously independent lives, and 6 months of building a business together. I think it can survive 6 months of international adventure. The conversation continued over several days as we talked through the practical and emotional implications of my accepting the Costa Rica position. Mark's architecture firm was in the middle of their busiest season, making it impossible for him to take extended time away. We would be separated by thousands of miles and multiple time zones during what was supposed to be our engagement period. But the more we discussed it, the more convinced I became that this opportunity represented exactly the kind of challenge our relationship needed to face. We'd built something beautiful in the controlled environment of Denver, with established routines and familiar support systems. Testing that foundation against real distance and genuine independence would either strengthen it or reveal weaknesses we needed to address before making permanent commitments. Jessica's reaction to my decision was characteristically direct and completely supportive. "Good for you," she said, when I called to tell her I'd accepted the position. "Too many women give up opportunities because they're afraid of threatening their relationships. If Mark can't handle you pursuing your dreams, then he's not the right person anyway." "He's been nothing but supportive," I protested. "Even better. That means you're choosing to go because it's right for you, not because you're running away from him. That's the mark of a healthy relationship." Danny's response was more emotional than I'd expected. When I told him about Costa Rica during one of our equipment cleaning sessions, he stopped mid-wipe and stared at me. "6 months?" he said. "Who's going to keep me grounded when the kickboxing participants get too aggressive?" "You managed just fine before I started working here," I laughed. "Before you started working here, I was angrier and less patient with people," Danny replied seriously. "You've made me a better teacher, Lisa. The community center isn't going to be the same without you." His words touched me more deeply than I'd expected. I'd been so focused on the professional opportunity and the relationship implications that I hadn't fully considered how my absence would affect the daily community I'd become part of. Patricia proved to be surprisingly pragmatic about my departure, though she made me promise to document every aspect of my Costa Rica experience for potential integration into our own programming. 6 months isn't forever, she said. And what? You learn there will benefit our retreats for years to come. Plus, We'll hold your position and cover your classes with substitutes who understand this is temporary. The month leading up to my departure was a whirlwind of preparation, both practical and emotional. Mark helped me research Costa Rica's climate and cultural considerations, while I worked with retreat participants to create a transition plan that wouldn't disrupt their practice routines. We spent long evenings talking about communication strategies, time zone management, and the ways we would maintain intimacy across distance. Mark surprised me by suggesting we treat the separation as an experiment in intentional connection rather than an endurance test to survive. "I want to know you better after 6 months apart than I do now," he said one evening as we walked through our favorite park. "I want this experience to deepen our relationship, not just preserve it." His approach transformed my anxiety about leaving into excitement about the adventure we would share, even while physically separated. We planned weekly video dates, daily text check-ins, and monthly care packages in both directions. The night before my departure, Mark cooked an elaborate farewell dinner featuring all my favorite foods. We ate by candlelight in his dining room, the same space where we'd shared so many meals while learning each other's rhythms and preferences. "I have something for you," he said as we finished dessert, producing a small wrapped package from somewhere behind his chair. Inside was a leather journal with my initials embossed on the cover. "For documenting your adventures," he explained, "and for writing letters to me when email feels too impersonal." I flipped through the blank pages, imagining them filled with observations about Costa Rican landscapes, insights about international teaching methods, and love letters to the man who was brave enough to let me go so I could choose to come back. "I have something for you too," I said, handing him an envelope I'd been carrying for days. Mark opened it to find a hand-drawn map of Costa Rica with heart symbols marking the places I was most excited to explore. On the back, I'd written a letter, explaining how his support had given me the courage to accept opportunities that scared me. "You've taught me that love doesn't mean making yourself smaller to fit into someone else's life," I'd written. "It means growing large enough to create space for both people to become who they're meant to be." We made love that night with an intensity that felt both like goodbye and like a promise. Afterward, lying in Mark's arms while he slept, I memorized the sound of his breathing, the way his hand curved around my waist, the scent of his skin mixed with the familiar detergent he used on his sheets. The airport departure was emotional but not dramatic. Mark walked me to security, carrying my yoga mat bag while I managed my suitcase, and the nervousness that threatened to overwhelm my excitement. 6 months, he said, his hands framing my face as we stood in the busy terminal. 6 months, I agreed, rising on my toes to kiss him deeply enough to last until we could do it again in person. "I love you, Lisa. Go have the adventure of a lifetime." "I love you too. Take care of our life here so I have something beautiful to come home to." As my plane lifted off from Denver International Airport, I watched the Front Range Mountains shrink below me while simultaneously feeling my heart expand with possibility. I was flying towards 6 months of unknown challenges and incredible opportunities, supported by a man who loved me enough to trust the strength of what we'd built together. Costa Rica exceeded every expectation I'd harbored about the experience. The resort was located on the Pacific coast near Manuel Antonio, surrounded by rainforest that teemed with wildlife I'd only seen in documentaries. Howler monkeys woke me each morning with their territorial calls, and I fell asleep to the sound of waves breaking against volcanic rock formations. The work itself proved to be the perfect blend of challenging and rewarding. I was tasked with developing programming for guests dealing with major life transitions, divorce, career changes, grief, chronic illness, who came to Costa Rica seeking renewal and perspective. My own experience with rebuilding after divorce gave me credibility with participants, while the trauma-informed training I'd completed in Denver provided practical tools for creating safe spaces for emotional processing. Working with local instructors to integrate traditional Costa Rican wellness practices with contemporary yoga methodology, opened my understanding of how movement and mindfulness functioned across different cultures. I learned Spanish phrases that had no direct English equivalent, but perfectly captured concepts I'd been trying to express in my teaching for years. The letters I wrote to Mark in my leather journal became a daily practice that kept our connection alive across the distance. I told him about the sloth I'd spotted during a morning walk, the breakthrough moment when a participant finally felt safe enough to share her story of surviving domestic violence. The way sunrise over the Pacific Ocean made me understand why people talked about the healing power of natural beauty. Mark's responses arrived through a combination of emails, text messages, and handwritten letters that he mailed weekly. He shared updates about his work, including a sustainable housing project that was incorporating design elements inspired by our conversations about creating spaces for healing and growth. He sent photos of Colorado's changing seasons, our friends' activities, and the progress he was making on a surprise project he refused to describe in detail. "I'm building something for us," was all he would say when I pressed for information. During our weekly video calls, "Something I hope will be ready when you come home." The most challenging aspect of our separation wasn't the distance or the time zone complications. It was learning to trust that our relationship could maintain its intimacy and growth even when we couldn't share daily experiences directly. Some weeks felt effortless, with seamless communication and shared excitement about our respective adventures. Other weeks, technical difficulties and scheduling conflicts made connection feel forced and frustrating. The low point came during my third month in Costa Rica, when a particularly intense retreat session left me emotionally drained and missing Mark with an intensity that felt physically painful. We'd missed our scheduled video call due to a power outage at the resort, and by the time we reconnected, I was feeling disconnected and questioning whether the distance was worth the professional growth I was experiencing. "I miss you so much it hurts," I told him through tears during our rescheduled call. "I keep wondering if this was a mistake, if I should have chosen us over this opportunity." Mark's image on my laptop screen was pixelated due to poor internet connection, but his voice came through clearly. "Lisa, missing each other isn't a sign that we made the wrong choice. It's confirmation that what we have is worth missing." His words provided the perspective shift I needed to recommit to the experience, rather than simply enduring it. I began approaching the remaining months as an active choice rather than something I had to get through, which transformed both my professional effectiveness and my emotional well-being. The breakthrough came during my fourth month when I was leading a retreat for women rebuilding their lives after major losses. One participant, Maria, a widow from San Jose who'd never done yoga before, made a comment that crystallized everything I'd been learning about resilience and renewal. "Señora Lisa," she said after a particularly emotional session where she'd finally allowed herself to grieve her husband's death, "before I came here, I thought healing meant going back to who I was before the pain. Now I understand that healing means becoming someone who can carry the pain and still find joy." Her insight perfectly captured what I'd discovered about my own journey with Mark. Love after loss wasn't about returning to previous innocence, but about developing the capacity to remain open despite having been hurt. The months in Costa Rica weren't testing whether our relationship could survive separation. They were proving that we'd built something resilient enough to grow even under challenging circumstances. I began incorporating Maria's wisdom into my teaching, helping retreat participants understand that transformation often required temporary discomfort in service of long-term growth. The work became more effective as I spoke from genuine experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Mark sensed the shift in my perspective during our calls, commenting that I seemed more grounded and confident in my professional identity than I'd ever been. "You sound like someone who knows exactly who she is and what she's capable of," he said during one particularly good connection in month 5. "I feel like someone who's finally grown into herself," I replied, realizing the truth of the statement as I said it. The final month in Costa Rica was bittersweet. I'd fallen in love with the landscape, the culture, and the profound satisfaction of work that felt perfectly aligned with my skills and values. But I'd also reached the natural conclusion of what this experience had to teach me. I was ready to integrate what I'd learned into the life Mark and I were building together. My last week at the resort was filled with farewell gatherings, documentation sessions for the programs I'd developed, and quiet moments of gratitude for an experience that had changed me in fundamental ways. The staff threw a goodbye party complete, with traditional Costa Rican food, live music, and heartfelt speeches about the impact my work had made on both guests and colleagues. "You came here as a yoga teacher," said Carlos, the resort's wellness director, during his toast. "But you leave as a healer who happens to use yoga as one of her tools. That evolution has elevated everything we do here." His words captured something essential about my professional development over the 6 months. I'd arrived in Costa Rica as someone who taught yoga classes. I was returning to Denver as someone who created transformative experiences that happened to include yoga practice. The flight home felt different from my departure 6 months earlier. Instead of nervous excitement about unknown challenges, I experienced calm anticipation about reuniting with the life and love I'd chosen to return to. The journal Mark had given me was filled with observations, sketches, pressed flowers, and love letters that documented not just my geographic adventure, but my internal journey toward greater confidence and clarity. Mark was waiting at baggage claim when I emerged from customs, holding a bouquet of blue hydrangeas that perfectly matched my favorite color. The sight of him after 6 months of pixelated video calls made my heart race with the same intensity I'd felt during our first coffee date. "Welcome home," he said, pulling me into an embrace that felt like coming back to myself. "I missed you so much," I said against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent that no amount of international adventure could replace. The drive from the airport gave us time to begin bridging the gap between our separate experiences of the past 6 months. Mark told me about the projects he'd completed, the friends who'd asked about me constantly, and the changes in our Denver community that I'd missed. "I have a surprise for you," he said as we pulled into an unfamiliar neighborhood in the foothills, west of the city. "The project I've been working on." We stopped in front of a small house that looked like something from a home design magazine. The architecture was clearly Mark's work, featuring clean lines, natural materials, and windows positioned to capture optimal mountain views. But what took my breath away was the separate structure behind the main house. A beautiful studio space with floor-to-ceiling windows and what appeared to be a covered outdoor deck perfect for yoga practice. "Mark," I whispered, staring at the buildings that represented months of work I'd had no idea he was doing. "What is this?" "It's us," he said simply. "The main house is designed for the life we want to build together. The studio is designed for the work you want to do. Teaching, private sessions, small retreats, whatever direction your career takes next." I walked around the property in stunned silence, taking in details that showed how carefully Mark had considered my needs and dreams. The studio had built-in storage for yoga props, a sound system for music and meditation, and heating that would allow year-round use despite Colorado's climate variations. "The house isn't finished inside," Mark continued, his voice betraying nervousness about my reaction. "I wanted you to help design the interior spaces so they feel like ours rather than mine." I turned to face him, this man who'd spent 6 months building a physical manifestation of the future we'd only talked about in abstract terms. "Are you asking me to move in with you?" I asked, though the answer was obvious from the care he'd put into creating spaces for both our individual needs and our shared life. "I'm asking you to build a home with me," Mark replied, pulling the familiar velvet box from his pocket. "Not just a house, but a life that has room for both our dreams." This time, the box contained a different ring. The engagement ring was more elaborate than the promise ring, but equally thoughtful, featuring the same sapphire stone surrounded by smaller diamonds that caught the late afternoon light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. "Lisa," Mark said, dropping to one knee in front of the studio he'd built for my career. Will you marry me? Will you choose to build something permanent with someone who loves exactly who you are and who you're still becoming? The question I'd been unconsciously afraid of for 6 months had been answered definitively during my time in Costa Rica. The distance hadn't weakened our connection. It had proven that what we had was strong enough to survive separation and grow through independent experiences. Yes, I said, extending my left hand toward him. Yes to marriage. Yes to this house. Yes to building a life that's big enough for both our dreams. As Mark slipped the engagement ring onto my finger next to the promise ring I'd worn through 6 months of international adventure, I felt the satisfying click of pieces falling into perfect alignment. This was what I'd been moving toward without knowing it. A partnership that enhanced rather than limited both people's potential for growth. How does it feel? Mark asked, the same question he'd posed when he'd given me the promise ring. Like everything I didn't know I was brave enough to want, I replied, the words echoing something I'd written in my journal during a particularly homesick week in Costa Rica. We spent the evening touring our future home, planning interior layouts, and discussing how the space would accommodate both our work and our shared life. The house felt like a physical manifestation of the emotional architecture we'd been building together. Strong enough to provide security, flexible enough to accommodate growth, beautiful enough to inspire daily gratitude. That night, sleeping in Mark's bed after 6 months of hotel accommodations and guest quarters, I dreamed about the retreat center I would eventually build using everything I'd learned in Costa Rica and the studio Mark had created for my immediate needs. In the dream, couples who'd been separated by distance or circumstances came to learn what Mark and I had discovered, that real love wasn't about avoiding separation, but about choosing reunion. I woke before dawn, the same time I'd been rising in Costa Rica to practice yoga on the beach before the resort day began. Mark was still sleeping beside me, one hand resting on my waist in the possessive way that had made me feel cherished from our earliest nights together. Looking at the engagement ring catching first light through Mark's carefully positioned windows, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 2 people who'd been broken by previous relationships, who'd approached love again with appropriate caution and hard-earned wisdom. We'd taken our time, been honest about our fears, and chosen each other not despite the risks, but because we'd developed the tools to navigate them together. I was 38 years old, a yoga instructor who'd built an international reputation, while choosing to return home to the man who'd loved me enough to let me go. We weren't perfect people living a perfect love story. We were real people who'd created space for each other's growth while building something lasting together. Later that morning, as I led my first yoga class in the studio Mark had built for our shared future, I looked out at the mountains that had drawn me to Colorado years earlier and felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd finally learned to trust both herself and the person she'd chosen to love. The ring on my finger caught the morning light and threw it back in tiny rainbows, a perfect metaphor for the way love could transform ordinary moments into something luminous and eternal. I was home, exactly where I belonged, with exactly the person who made everything else possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.